Podcast After the Union, Episode 2, English Lessons in the Time Spiral. A Soviet boy from cold Siberia meets aliens on the streets of sunny Odessa. Smart headphones say goodbye to the language barrier. Now a migrant feels confident in any country. The lazy brain trap, then and now. Why we still find reasons not to learn English, even in the age of AI.
I've always been curious. Why is the human world built this way? Why are we so different? How we think, what we believe? Some people live with old anger. Some just go with the flow, choosing easy answers from authorities. Others think they already know everything about this life. And me? I just never stop being amazed by how complex and multi-layered everything is. This amazement, this desire to watch how we change, is what drives my podcast. I don't want to put people into boxes. Everyone has their own relationship with reality. But one thing connects us all. Everyone feels how this world affects them. That's why the topics I talk about will definitely connect with you. Today, I want to talk about how time moves in a spiral and brings us back to similar situations years later. Let's take the English language. 40 years ago, we didn't learn it because we lived in isolation and saw no point. Today, we don't learn it because we are drowning in information and believe that AI will do everything for us. But the real reason is the same. Our brain is lazy. It needs discipline and effort, but it keeps building traps to avoid studying. Even now, in the era of artificial intelligence, when we have all the tools in the world. This similarity is the key to understanding what is happening to us right now. I have to confess, this podcast was supposed to be completely different. About 3 years ago, I left Russia. Living in a new country and a new culture, I had to learn a new language. I tried different methods. Zoom meetings with tutors, language schools, and conversation groups. And, of course, smartphone apps with flashcards. I needed to listen to the language to train my ears. That's how I discovered learning podcasts, episodes recorded specifically for students from level A1 to B2. It was very useful. You don't just train your hearing, you also learn about the culture. Then I had a great idea. What if I record my stories in simple Russian for people who learn it at B1 level? I wanted to start a podcast for a long time, and it felt like I finally found the perfect format. At first, it looked like a great business plan: Patreon subscriptions, study materials, vocabulary lists. I even started writing the first episodes, but something inside was stopping me from fully believing in this project. I realized I was trying to sell a ticket for a train that had already left. In that moment, I understood that the main rule of my podcast must be honesty. Honesty with you and with myself. Honesty in my memories, my conclusions, and the reason why I am doing this at all. This podcast is not just for me to understand the changes. It is also a showcase from my professional work. I create digital video content, and through this project, I am looking for both like-minded people and new clients. Later in this episode, I will tell you more about this. So, I realized just in time that a language podcast would take me away from the truly important and complex topics. It wouldn't let me explore the era we live in now. And I want to talk about the changes we are seeing today. By the way, learning foreign languages is a perfect example of the changes that started after the Union collapsed and continue today. Shall we look at the past? I am sure many of you will recognize yourselves. When I was a kid in the Soviet Union, my world was very small. It was closed. We had almost no idea how people lived in other countries. Of course, we knew other cultures through books. We imagined different nations by reading the classics. Cervantes gave us the brave Spanish character. Conan Doyle showed us the royal manners of the English. Mark Twain showed how Americans value freedom. But these were just cultural images, and of course, we didn't read the originals, only Russian translations. Propaganda on TV and in newspapers told us about the modern world. Everything from abroad was filtered through censorship. Every news story had one filter. Does this help build socialism or does it hurt it? The world was black and white, loyal friends of the Union or sworn enemies. It was a constant fight, hungry capitalism on one side and the oppressed working class on the other. So books and TV were our only sources, and everything was only in Russian. Very few Soviet citizens had access to foreign literature. My childhood was 100% monolingual. But sometimes artifacts from the outside world broke into this closed space. One day before New Year, my father brought home a big box of bananas from Cuba. It was the first time I saw and tasted this fruit, but the box stayed with us. It was beautiful, covered in words I couldn't read. The bananas were gone quickly, but the box sat in the shed for years. Looking at those bright, strange letters, I really thought for the first time, somewhere out there is a huge world where people don't understand Russian at all. Back then, I had no English lessons. I didn't even think it was possible to learn it. I just knew there were other countries behind a closed door, and that box was like a key. My father helped me translate the words on the cardboard and showed me the English alphabet. Those foreign labels gave me so much energy, I wanted to learn the words myself. Foreign speech also leaked in through the TV. Usually, it was movies about Soviet spies in the enemy's rear. There, a foreign language sounded like a dangerous code, something you had to know perfectly to survive. Sometimes it was the names of foreign football clubs or brands of rare cigarettes in movies. Then came the chewing gum with wrappers. They were so valuable, I collected them like stamps. Many wrappers had comics on them. It was impossible to translate them, they were in Turkish, and you couldn't find a Turkish dictionary in the whole city. But I remembered every strange word, trying to guess the meaning. Every case like this was a signal. There is a hidden reality outside our language. At age 10, my world changed. My parents and I traveled from cold Siberia to the Black Sea, to Odessa. Back then, Ukraine was part of the Union. For us, it was just a warm, beautiful part of our country. Everything was new, the southern sun, fruit trees, and the sea. And the port of Odessa, where ships came from all over the world. I remember standing on the sun-filled Deribasovskaya street and just freezing. Right in front of me, black people were walking down the street. For the first time in my life, I saw them for real, not in a textbook picture. It was a shock. I couldn't look away. In that moment, I felt like I wasn't in the Soviet Union anymore. I was in that distant, unknown country they came from. They were just walking by, calm and normal, but I felt. My world just grew 100 times bigger. Since then, that city became my portal to the big world. I always want to go back there because that's where I first felt the breath of a planet that is much bigger than our closed backyard. In 5th grade, English lessons started. At first, I hated it. I forgot about that banana box. My interest turned into denial. Why do I need this? I couldn't imagine a future where I would cross a border. I had no idea I would ever visit other countries and speak another language. The world outside the Union felt like another planet with no tickets available. So, school English felt like studying a dead language, like Latin. There are rules and grades, but you can never use it in real Soviet life. I didn't know that in a few years, the Iron Curtain would fall. A flood of foreign things entered our lives. For us, growing up with gray reality, everything from abroad was fascinating. We wanted to touch and understand every new thing. Suddenly, everything cool, movies on tapes, songs, magazines, was in English. To understand a Snickers wrapper or the instructions on a German shampoo, you needed a paper dictionary nearby. English stopped being a theory. It became the only way to understand this new, colorful reality. School lessons were still boring. Maybe because starting at age 12 is a bit late for natural learning. But the main problem was the tools. Education was just three things: a textbook, a notebook, and a paper dictionary. We just wrote words in columns and memorized rules that had nothing to do with the real world. The words in my notebook and the words used by Arnold Schwarzenegger in the movie were two different worlds. It's funny to remember now. Back then, our language skills were like an old joke. English class. The teacher says, Vovachka, translate the phrase, I don't know. Vovachka, blushing. I don't know. Teacher, well done, Vovachka, perfect, sit down. We didn't do our homework because we saw no point. Why waste energy on dead rules? Sometimes I imagine myself as a fifth grader today. Every kid has a smartphone with instant translators. Would that make me want to learn the language more? In my childhood, there were no apps, no smartphones. At home, I had a giant yellow dictionary that my dad used, and another tiny one from the beginning of the century. It was a constant problem. Foreign magazines had modern slang. Computer games had terms that didn't exist when my old dictionaries were printed. You could search my dad's dictionary forever, but you wouldn't find the word Terminator. There was no breakdance, thriller, or Walkman. My dictionaries were frozen in the past. Foreign words were everywhere. There was no time to look up the lyrics to Chérie Chérie Lady. To learn a new word, you had to be a detective. Ask friends, guess by context, or wait for someone cool to explain it. I remember how I confused my English teacher by asking her to translate Michael Jackson's Give In To Me. She got embarrassed and blushed and finally said, "We will learn this in the older classes." Back then, learning a language wasn't a click. It was a long, patient search for information. Over the years, things changed. Computers entered my life. CD-ROM dictionaries replaced paper. You could find the word in seconds. It felt like a miracle. Then came smartphones, an extension of our hands. We got apps, flashcards, and high-speed internet. Music was always a big part of my life. I wanted to know what Metallica or Modern Talking were singing about. With the internet, it became easy. It felt like we reached the peak of comfort. But recently, a tectonic shift happened. AI. Before, we had to search and process data ourselves. Now, we delegate the work of thinking to machines. Our brain relaxed and trusted the algorithms. But right before I dived into this new comfort, I had the most stressful stage of my life. A few years before the AI era started, I left Russia. Being in a new country at age 40 plus, I was in a storm. I had to learn a new local language and finish my English at the same time. My work and survival depended on it. I was inside that big world I dreamed of as a kid. I had to communicate now. It wasn't an exercise. My head was exploding. Then, almost instantly, the AI era arrived. Tools appeared that took away all that stress. browser translators, AI tutors, smart apps, and even smart headphones translating in real time. All this made me relax. And I caught myself thinking that same fifth grade thought. Why do I even need to learn this? The time spiral returned to the same phase. As a kid, I didn't see the point because of the closed USSR. Now, I ask the same question because technology erases every barrier. But this is where a new understanding is born. Why do we need a foreign language today? First, real connection. Technology is the middleman, but personal contact, speaking without crutches, is a huge advantage. It's a different level of trust. Second, brain health. Our neurons need a workout. In an automated world, learning a language is the best way to keep your mind sharp. And finally, English today is the language of technology. It is, if you like, a remote control for AI. As I said at the beginning, this podcast is also a way for me to find clients. I create digital video content. I have more than 20 years in production, directing, editing, graphics. This is my foundation. And AI today helps me to make projects in a new way, bright and atmospheric. I help brands and people to pack their ideas into visual images. If you have meanings that need to come to life or you need a promo for Reels, I am here. For big and complex tasks, I bring in my trusted team, professionals with huge experience. So we are ready for projects of any scale. I turn ideas into pictures that people remember. My contacts are in the description. Write to me. Let's discuss your tasks. But let's go back to our topic. Today, English language has basically replaced programming languages. The era of vibe coding is here. You just describe the result you want with words, and the software is ready. Of course, it's not that simple, but knowing English gives a huge advantage. The result is much more accurate. I should mention that digital co-authors, AI models, help me with this podcast. In their brains, they think in English, even if they talk to me in Russian. It's amazing how they catch this Soviet vibe of my memories. English became a living environment where my episodes and the vertical videos I make for them are born. Sometimes AI tries too hard to sound smart and uses complex words that make no sense. In those moments, I remember a joke. In the USSR, a party bureaucrat could write a perfect report without a single original thought. Now AI does the same. But AI needs thousands of servers in Arizona, and that bureaucrat only needed a bottle of vodka. Jokes aside, this reminds me to make sure the living person doesn't get lost. Technology is just a tool. We provide the meaning. I have huge respect for those who keep making educational podcasts. AI will never replace a talented teacher and the energy they give to a student. In the end, a human will always need a human. My podcast is just another personal story. I look for rhymes of the past in our present. Because when you realize that all of this has happened before, changes stop being scary. They just fall into place. Subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss no story and you don't close. Now a line, you know more by listening today. By hope for you look at. That Christy are looking a little if podcast by success for blend. My additional is by the way by previous product. May do make the days of context and visit all over talking about existing the creative unity. In the end, when you realize that reelin's done, it's primitely anything. Because when you realize that making the vertical forms to the stuff in the relook. Because when you realize that realins then is thus provide the autumnal about to the first time. My podcast has been just to consider that me that they recross the tradictive and click the name. Because when you realize that all of this has happened before, they just fall into place and keep list. Because when you realize that all of this has happened by them or this. In the end of the podcast, so you don't miss no story and to click the name. This actually different Christian because when you realize that all of this has happened before. In the end, when you realize that all of this has happened before, they just fall into place. My podcast has been just to consider that me that they recross the tradictive and click the name. Because when you realize that all of this has happened before, they just fall into place. Because when you realize that all of this has happened before. Because when you realize that all of this has happened before, the existing the Christian in the language of story. My podcast is much about additionally and they get all of the more meant because when you realize that all of this has happened before. You look for additionally by the 10 molt in the place when you realize that all of this has happened before. In the end of the podcast so you don't miss no story and to click the name. My podcast is much about additionally by the language of story. Because when you realize that all of this has happened before. My podcast has been just to consider that we that they recross the tradictive and click the name. Because when you realize that all of this has happened before. Because when you realize that all of this has happened before. My podcast has been just to consider that we that they recross the tradictive. My podcast has been just to consider that we did notness. Because when you realize that all of this has happened before. My podcast has been just to consider that we that they recross the tradictive and click the name. And that's what I go in and stretching for description. Because when you realize that all of this has happened before. My podcast has been just to consider that we that they recross the tradictive and click the name. Because when you realize that all of this has happened before. My podcast has been just to consider that we that they recross the tradictive and click the name. My protector that end of the bottoms from the first time they played the business. When you realize that all of this has happened before. In the end, when you realize that all of this has happened before. My podcast has been just to consider that we that they recross the tradictive and click the name. Released in this tractors, and this thing's all of the anomaly. But next to stay the morn is when you realize that all of this has happened before. In the end, when you realize that all of this has happened before. In the second, this is fall in termlings and the 6%. About COVID case in the 6%. But next to stay the morn is when you realize that all of this has happened before. But this when you realize that all of this has happened. Bingen thinks this more too much more as the convinced in to say. So podcast so you don't miss new episodes. We are just getting started. Bye.